Hey guys, welcome back. Today is finally time to break out the Harridan. I've been putting this off for months now, as I knew this was going to be a monumental task just to get this assembled, never mind working out how I'm going to paint this monstrosity. It's an absolutely huge model, and thankfully I managed to get a good deal on it buying it second-hand from eBay. When it did arrive, there were a few parts of the model that had broken off, but it was nothing that a little super glue couldn't fix. There was also a ton of large resin sprue still attached to all of the pieces on the model, and I had to work out a way of how I was going to get rid of them. And the rest of the bits just came in a big bag. So before starting assembly, I started to gather all the tools that I thought I would need for the job. Firstly, I got myself a big ass saw blade, which made me feel like an extra from Big Trouble in Little China. Hopefully this would be useful for sawing off some of the large chunks of resin sprue still on the model. And I have my usual bag of sanding sticks, which I can use to smooth out any of the cuts. A variety of drills and drill bits, which I'll be using to drill in holes for the magnetization that I'm planning. Speaking of which, I'm going to need a bunch of magnets as well, of various different sizes. And I've also got a knockoff Dremel type tool as well, which will hopefully help speed up some of the sanding process. So now that I had all my tools, it was time to begin the cleanup process. And I started off by just hacksawing off all of the large chunks of resin still left on the model. There are quite a few of these, but most of them did come off with relative ease. Then it was simply a case of switching between the saw and a pair of clippers, depending on the size of tool needed for the job. And once I'd removed all the excess bits of resin, it was time for using the Dremel and the sanding sticks to sand everything down smoothly. Now that the model had been cleaned, it was time to start on the magnetization. And I started off with the wings, and as they are quite large and heavy, I decided to go with some nice beefy magnets, and I believe these ones were 10mm by 5mm. And the idea was to get 2 magnets on each wing, just to make sure I got a nice strong connection. And when drilling these holes, this is by far the messiest part of the process, with lots of bits of resin and particles of resin absolutely everywhere. So make sure you do wear a respirator mask of some kind, as I'm pretty sure inhaling some of this stuff isn't going to be the best for you. And once you've drilled in sufficiently sized holes, all you need to do is super glue the magnets into place. and then give them some time to dry and bond to the resin. Next, I switched the polarity of the magnets to ensure that the positive and negative would align, in preparation for the next part, which was to try and correctly place the other magnets into the wing sockets, making sure they align with the magnets in the wing. And the way I achieved that was to put a small blob of paint onto each magnet on the wing, and then fit it into place into the socket, hoping that the paint will make contact with the back part of the socket, leaving a mark indicating where the centre of the magnet should go. Unfortunately, I didn't leave enough time for the glue to set, and it did pop the magnet out of the wing. However, it did give me marks to indicate where to drill my next holes. Once I'd finished magnetising the wings and the tail, I wanted to do a little bit of work on the legs of the model. Once they're in place, they have this kind of weird position where they're tucked underneath the body, and I wanted to try and bring them out to the side of the model, which was going to involve me trying to bend the leg out without it snapping. So I just used a hairdryer to blast the elbow joint over and over till it was hot enough, and then just applied some pressure with my hands to slowly bend it out. And just repeated this process until I was happy with the positioning, so that they were more to the side of the model rather than tucked underneath. Now that all of that's out the way, it's time to start the painting process. And the first step is, starting from a white primer, is to paint in all of the armour plates in black. I used Army Painter Matte Black, but honestly any black would do here. And you just want to get a nice solid coat of this across all of the armour plates or carapace of the model, making sure that you don't leave any kind of white spots left behind. And at this point I had magnetised all of the parts of the model apart from the head, and also I hadn't magnetised the connection between the base and the body of the model. So all throughout the painting process I was trying to be really careful with the main body of the model, as it's essentially just a giant brick that is glued onto a stick, and I felt at any moment it was going to snap off. However, it somehow didn't. And it was at this starting point of painting the model when I realised just how big of a task this was going to be. I knew this model was big, and certainly it was going to be a challenge to paint, but just painting in all of these armour parts took me almost half a day, and towards the end I was beginning to think that I was going to run out of black paint during the process. However, I just soldiered on, trying to paint the model section by section, and tried my best to not think about how long this was going to take me. Next step was to start to highlight up all of the black armour parts, and I did that using an airbrush with Army Painter Night Sky, which is a really nice dark blue-grey, similar to Citadel the Fang, which is the colour I used previously in my other Hive Fleet Typhon videos. But either of these or a nice dark blue-grey would do here. And we just want to apply this to each one of the armour panels on the model, and you want to cover roughly about 50 to 70% of each of the panels, leaving some of the black still visible left behind. And if you don't have an airbrush, you could dry brush this step on. I do have several other Hive Fleet Typhon videos on how to do the dry brushing technique. But because of the size and also the cost of this model, I decided to go with the airbrush, as it's going to be much faster and also give a much smoother final finish. It was also at this stage when I started to notice some of the aesthetic changes in this model in comparison to the other models in the Tyranid range, which were going to make this a little bit of a challenge to paint this model in the Hive Fleet Typhon colour scheme. With the Typhon scheme being one of the most complex of the Hive Fleets to paint, I was starting to wish I'd just painted the whole thing purple and done a Hive Fleet Leviathan video, but that wouldn't have been any fun. And also wouldn't look too good amongst my entire Hive Fleet Typhon army. Next, we're going to apply the final highlight layer to the armour plates, and to do that I used Army Painter Runic Cobalt, and it's just the same drill here as the previous layer. Only difference being is we want to cover a smaller area, leaving plenty of the previous layer still visible under this new highlight layer. And the final step to finish up the armour is to give it a very light dry brush of Army Painter Frost Blue. The airbrush does a really good job of creating nice and smooth highlights. However, it doesn't deal with the edge highlighting, and that's what we're going to do with this dry brush step. We want to make sure we've got a minimum amount of paint on the brush, and we just want to lightly dry brush all of the edges and ridges across all of the armour plates on the model. And this is going to give us a nice edge highlight to all of these areas without having to painstakingly go in and line it all by hand. Next, using a combination of Vallejo Express Deep Purple and Cardinal Purple, mixed in 1:1, and I'm going to apply this to all of the areas on the model that I want to be in the reddish pink colour. Starting off with the head of the model, and I'm just going to paint in all of the mouth area and also all of the gums. And normally for my Hive Fleet Typhon models I would use Citadel Volupus Pink. However, this mix provides a more vibrant colour, so I'm going to use this for the Harridan. But using Volupus Pink would give a similar result also. Moving on to the main body of the model, and there are a few areas here that need to be painted in, including the fleshy area on the front below the head, a couple of horns that are towards the back of the model, and I also went in and painted in between all of the rib cages as well. Just be careful not to paint in the flesh that's stretched in between the ribs in this colour, but if you do, you can always just go back in and touch it up with some white paint. And the same goes for the tail. I just went in and painted in all of the fleshy areas in between all of the skin. There are a bunch of horns and claws spread out throughout the model, And I just went in and painted these in as well with the same colour, switching between the brush and the airbrush depending on the size of the area. And for the wings, I airbrushed this onto all of the membrane, trying to leave a small gap between the membrane and the claws, where the membrane seems stretched and is pulling away from the claws. And just apply this to each one of the panels on the wings until you get a nice smooth coat. And to highlight all of these areas, I used Army Painter Barbarian Flesh, but any similar rosy skin tone would do here. And I just applied this in a triangle shape over the previous layer, leaving plenty of the previous colour still visible left behind. Then, after painting in all the other areas on the wing I wanted in this colour, including all the little slits and gashes and boils that are spread across the main arm, I then applied some shade by using Army Painter Magenta Tone, and I applied 2 coats of this to all of the areas that we just painted on the wings, making sure I allowed sufficient drying time between applying the second coat. And for the arms I used Citadel Space Wolves Grey, and I just applied 2 coats of this to the top part of the arm, from the shoulder down to the elbow joint. And I did this for both of the arms with the large talons on them, and also both of the arms that are on the underside of the wing as well. When it came to all of the chest bones on the main body of the model, I used the Army Painter Purple Triad, firstly base coating all of the ribs in Cultist Purple, then moving up the triad, applying highlights to smaller and smaller areas, starting with Hexed Violet and then moving on to Violet Coven. And in the same fashion, I highlighted up all of the horns and talons on the model using the Army Painter Pink Triad. More specifically, I used Pixie Pink and Weird Elixir. I used a brush for all of the smaller claws and talons, and I used the airbrush for any of the larger ones on the model. Then when that's done, it's back to the Army Painter Magenta Tone to give all of the claws and talons a wash. And this should help tie in all of the highlights we've just applied. And if you're still not happy with the transition between the highlights, you can always go back in with a darker colour in the Pink Triad, something like Wicked Pink, just to smooth out any harsh transitions. Next, it was time to shade all of the white skin on the model. And as always, I'm going to be using Scale 75 Shadow Black. And as this is a very strong colour, I dilute this with 5 parts Glaze Medium. This is a very similar colour to Nuln Oil. The only difference is the Shadow Black has a slight tint of blue to it, so I prefer to use it for these Tyranid models, but Null & Oil would be absolutely fine as well, and so would Army Painter Dark Tone. The only difference being you won't need half as much of the glaze medium, as both of these are a lot thinner than the Shadow Black that I use. In addition to shading in all of the white parts in the wings, I also applied a coat of this to the pink and fleshy wing membrane as well. And I just applied this wash to all of the white parts on the model, including the head, the body and the tail as well. And the final part before getting to the basing and the final assembly is to go back to the Barbarian flesh tone and begin to highlight up all of the pink fleshy areas on the model. This is pretty much everything that we painted in with the deep purple cardinal purple mix, apart from the claws and the wing membranes. And there's a ton of these parts throughout the model, including the mouth and the gum line on the head, all of the fleshy areas under the rib cage and under the skin in the tail, and all of the little cuts and boils and egg sacs that are spread across the model. And once that was complete, I painted up the base in my usual Tyranid egg swarm bases, which I've got plenty of guides on how to do on my channel. And that's the model complete. It was a long and arduous process to assemble, build and paint this model. I think in total it took around 2 weeks, but in the end it was worth it, as I can finally add the Harridan to my Hive Fleet Typhon army. But anyway, I think I'm going to be tackling something a lot smaller for my next project, and give myself a little bit of a break from the enormous Forge World models. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed and found this video useful, and I'll catch you in the next one.